Hey you. Yeah, you, scrolling through the chaos of the internet, looking for something different. Well, tonight, you just found it. We're diving headfirst into a tale not exactly ancient, but oddly juicy all the same. One stitched together with sweat-soaked uniforms, lipstick-stained envelopes, and the timeless ache of longing. No gods or mango trees tonight, but instead, mail sacks stuffed with desire, and the almost mythic power of a well-written letter from home. This isn't some boring history lecture. It's a front-row seat to the quieter, pulsing drama behind one of the loudest wars in history, World War II, told in a way that won't rattle your nerves, but will definitely stir something in the quiet corners of your brain. And trust me, you'll walk away not just entertained, but weirdly moved. Weirder still? You might feel sleepy, which is kind of the point. So here's the deal. If you're into a bedtime story that's one part soap opera, one part archive, and just the right dash of whispered scandal, then settle in. And hey, drop your city plus local time in the comments so we know who's vibing with us in the history stream tonight. Now dim the lights, cue that background hum, and let's unfold the strange, sensual madness of war together. You're sitting on the edge of a narrow cot, itchy in your wool uniform, shoes muddy from the day's drills, and in your lap, a letter from home. It's scented faintly like lilac perfume. She always did that, even though you teased her for it. The envelope is soft at the edges, worn from being opened and reread half a dozen times. You already know every line, but you open it anyway. She writes about the neighbors, about rationing, about the cat climbing onto her lap when she reads. But then there's that one sentence, that delicious, cryptic, artfully scandalous line tucked in between weather updates and polite gossip. "I still remember the night before you left," she wrote, "and I still sleep on your side of the bed." That's all it takes. In the middle of a war zone, you're suddenly not here anymore. You're home in her arms, hearing the rain outside, your breath in sync. That was the magic trick of letters in World War II. They weren't just communication, they were seduction, confession, therapy, and hope, all wrapped in cheap stationery and wartime stamps. By 1945, American GIs were sending and receiving over 2 billion pieces of mail per year. Let that number hit you. 2 billion. It was the glue holding hearts together from thousands of miles apart. It was also one of the few places where unfiltered longing could exist without consequence, or so they thought. Mainstream historians agree that mail was essential to troop morale, and the military knew it. Mail call was sacred. Soldiers would skip meals, fall out of formation, sneak away from duties just to get their hands on that envelope from back home. One of the most commonly requested items from Red Cross stations? Not chocolate, not cigarettes, stationery, because even when you're thousands of miles from home, you still want to be wanted. Of course, not all letters were sweet. Some were heated, sultry, just this side of innocent. Entire genres of wartime code language evolved so that young women could hint at their desire without running afoul of the censors. Missing your warmth meant something more. "I wore your sweater last night" wasn't about fashion, it was about fantasy. Soldiers got creative too. They'd write about the curve of a lake in a way that clearly wasn't about geography, or mention how they dreamed of hot apple pie and other warm things. Let's be honest, the average 19-year-old GI wasn't a poet, but longing makes writers of us all. Some guys even carried entire bundles of letters, neatly folded, tucked inside helmet liners or beneath shirts. Charms against despair. They'd read them by flashlight, by moonlight, even during air raids. There's a recorded case of one British soldier crawling out of a trench under fire, just to retrieve a love letter that had slipped from his coat. But here's where things get weirder. Historians still argue whether these letters were purely emotional survival tools, or if they genuinely altered soldier behavior. Did a sexy letter from home reduce the likelihood of seeking company elsewhere? Did romantic connection reduce risk-taking, or did it just make the longing worse? There's no clear answer, but there are clues. In Italy, One young American soldier wrote in his journal, "I get her letters every Friday. I read them 4 times. I swear it keeps me from doing something stupid." His buddy, by contrast, had gone off with a local girl the week before, contracted gonorrhea, and spent 2 weeks out of commission in a field hospital. Letters might not have had antibiotics, but they had a kind of psychic penicillin. Still, you weren't just receiving, you were also writing. You'd find a quiet moment between missions, borrow a pen, steal some paper from a supply tent, and then, what to say? You didn't want to sound pathetic, but you needed her to know you were still the man she kissed goodbye at the train station. You wanted her to remember your hands, your mouth, your jokes, your weird little laugh. So maybe you described the stars above the tent that night, how they looked like the freckles on her shoulders. Maybe you lied a little, said you'd found a cafe that reminded you of your first date. Maybe you folded in a strand of your hair, or pressed your thumbprint on the page. And sometimes, you didn't mail it at all. You wrote it just to get through the night. Quirky tidbit? Some soldiers used invisible ink to slip racier thoughts past military censors. Lemon juice, onion juice, even milk. When heated, the words appeared. Of course, the trick was making sure your girl knew to hold the page over a candle, and not just assume you'd sent her a blank sheet like a lunatic. By the way, those censors? They were no joke. In both the US and UK, armies employed entire divisions just to open and read letters. Anything too explicit, gone. Anything criticizing the war effort, redacted. Soldiers were warned constantly that their letters could be intercepted by enemies, or even published as propaganda. Still, the passion found a way. Even within the rules, there was room for mischief. One GI addressed a letter to the Queen of My Universe, care of that sassy little town in Kansas. It reached her. That's how much the post office was committed to love. And then there were the Dear John letters, the ones that didn't soothe, didn't seduce, the ones that said, "I met someone else," or worse, "Please don't write me anymore." Some men burned them, some kept them. A few went silent for days. There's a story of one guy who read his Dear John, folded it quietly, stood up, and walked directly into enemy fire the next morning. Did the letter cause it? Or was it just the last thread in a fraying rope? Again, historians debate. What's not debated is how real the ache was. You, right now, staring into the dim light of your little bunk lamp, you'd understand that ache. You'd understand how a few words from someone who once kissed you, like they meant it could hold your whole body together when your world is shaking. Even now, when the war is long over, when your uniform is packed away and your medals are dusty, those letters still sit in a shoebox somewhere. Maybe they're in your attic. Maybe your grandchild found them and asked who Tilly was, and you just smiled. They were more than paper. They were desire, bottled and mailed, fragile and fierce. And all these years later, they still whisper when unfolded. You're out on patrol again, trudging through ankle-deep mud or dust, depending on the continent, with your rifle slung lazily over your shoulder and a mind wandering far, far from military protocol. You've got a letter from home folded in your breast pocket and 1,000 what-ifs playing on loop in your skull. But tonight, your thoughts don't stop with what's happening back home. They drift towards something closer, something more immediate. Because here's the thing, not all desire had to be imagined through paper. Sometimes it walked right past your post with a basket of bread and a wink. And sometimes desire spoke a language you didn't understand, but somehow still made itself perfectly clear. Fraternizing with locals during WWII wasn't just common, it was practically inevitable. You drop millions of young men into foreign lands, add months or years of boredom, loneliness, and hormones, and what do you think is going to happen? In cities newly liberated or occupied, soldiers often found themselves entangled in a whole different kind of conflict. One fought with flirtation, curiosity, and, occasionally, desperation. French girls in silk scarves, Filipino women selling mangoes by the roadside, German widows with eyes that didn't look away. This was a battlefield too, though no one wrote songs about it. Mainstream fact? In France after D-Day, local women often welcomed American soldiers warmly, sometimes a little too warmly for the comfort of their fellow citizens. The French government received waves of complaints from communities where fraternization was damaging local morals. One mayor, exasperated, described the U.S. troops as having an overly enthusiastic appetite for our daughters. The military command knew this was happening. They issued strict no fraternization policies, especially in Germany after the war, when occupation officially began. But enforcing those rules? That was like telling the tide not to come in. Soldiers found loopholes, ignored warnings, or just pretended the rules didn't apply. Because for many, these weren't just flings. They were temporary sanctuaries. A warm meal, a soft bed, a kind face. A few hours when you weren't private so-and-so, but just a man with a heartbeat and a need. Of course, not everyone approved. Back in the States, rumors swirled that soldiers were abusing their position, taking advantage of impoverished or desperate civilians. Some newspapers painted a picture of American GIs as either conquering heroes or immoral opportunists depending on the day's headlines. Historians still argue whether these relationships were mostly consensual and romantic, or often exploitative and power-skewed. Was it mutual need? Was it survival wrapped in affection? Or was it something more troubling? The truth, like most wartime stories, sits somewhere uncomfortably in the middle. And not all locals were thrilled either. In many places, women seen with soldiers were ostracized. In post-liberation France, some were paraded through towns with their heads shaved as punishment for so-called horizontal collaboration. Imagine that. One night of comfort, months of humiliation. But not every relationship was brief or tragic. Some soldiers fell hard. Weddings happened, sometimes hastily, sometimes passionately. Military officials tried to control that too. There were forms, permissions, background checks. You couldn't just fall in love, you had to file for it. Still, the heart wants what it wants, even in uniform. Quirky tidbit? In Italy, a group of enterprising teenage girls formed what they called the GI Girlfriend Club, handing out cards with their names, ages, and languages spoken. They offered conversation, dance lessons, and, how shall we say, companionship, for a chocolate bar or two. Capitalism meets chemistry. For the soldier, these connections could be exhilarating and deeply confusing. One night you're sharing bread with a Belgian woman whose husband died last winter. The next day, you're back in uniform, marching past the same house without looking in the window. You don't write about it in your letters. You can't. There's no space for nuance in military censorship or romantic jealousy. You tell your sweetheart you're staying strong, keeping your mind on her, and meanwhile, you can't forget the girl who patched your ripped sleeve and kissed your hand before you left her village behind. The military tried to keep a lid on it all. In some cases, commanding officers banned local interaction altogether. Some units were moved when relationships with civilians became a distraction. You might be reassigned just for falling in love with the wrong girl in the wrong town. And then there were the children. It's not something soldiers talked about much, especially not in letters. But babies were born from these wartime unions, thousands of them. Many were never acknowledged. Some were raised in whispers. Others became walking reminders of romances never meant to survive the front lines. After the war, women with GI babies often faced harsh judgment. Some were accused of betrayal. Others were simply forgotten by the men who never returned, or chose not to. And what about you? Maybe you weren't looking for anything serious. Maybe it started with a shared cigarette and ended with a bittersweet farewell. Maybe she called you Yank, and you never even told her your real name. But she made you laugh. She reminded you what it felt like to be human, not just a cog in a violent machine. One night, she invited you into her kitchen. There was soup, real soup, the kind that didn't come from a tin. She set down a chipped bowl, brushed your hand, and for a moment the war disappeared. just steam and spoonfuls and the smell of rosemary. And then came the curfew, back to base, back to pretending it didn't mean anything. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly intimacy blooms when time is uncertain. How easily you find yourself confessing things in broken languages and hushed tones. How a war zone can feel like the most romantic place on earth, if only for an hour. You don't talk about her when you return to the barracks. Not really. You might mention the food, the neighborhood, maybe how polite the family was. But you don't say her name, not out loud. Maybe you don't even remember it. And still, when you close your eyes that night, she's there. Fraternization wasn't just about sex. It was about escape, from fear, from death, from boredom, from the version of yourself that war forced you to wear. So yes, you broke the rule. You crossed the line. You kissed someone who didn't speak your language, in a town you can't spell, during a month you'll probably misremember. But for those few moments, you weren't a soldier, you were a person. And that, in the fog of war, might be the most forbidden feeling of all. You're back on base now. The morning sun hasn't quite cut through the chill, and your breath fogs in front of you as you stand in formation, half listening to roll call, half daydreaming about someone's arms around you, someone who doesn't smell like gun oil and ration stew. After breakfast, there's a package waiting for you in the mailroom. Not cookies, not socks. It's a thin, gray booklet with restricted, printed in bold across the cover. It's the military's official guide to sex. Well, sort of. It doesn't exactly use the word sex, not out loud. That would be improper. But it dances around the topic like a jitterbugger at the local VFW hall. Talks about personal conduct, clean living, and the dangers of indulgence. You flip it open. There's a diagram, not a helpful one. Welcome to Sexual Education WWII style. Mainstream fact alert. The U.S. War Department distributed thousands of pamphlets and booklets during World War II with titles like Facts About Venereal Disease, Sex Hygiene and Venereal Disease, and The Soldier's Guide to Staying Clean. They were awkward, moralizing, and full of euphemisms, but they were the military's attempt to deal with the very real reality that soldiers were, well, human. You're 19, maybe 20. You've just survived your first ambush, haven't slept in 2 days, and now someone in a neatly pressed uniform is telling you that your libido is a national security threat. They say it kindly, but the message is clear. Don't do anything stupid or unsanitary. You sit through a mandatory hygiene lecture in a makeshift classroom. The medic gives a strained talk about social diseases. No one asks questions. The posters on the wall say things like, "One night with Venus leads to a lifetime with Mercury," which would be funny if it weren't terrifying. Mercury was the common treatment for syphilis, by the way. Not great. Quirky tidbit. In one of the most widely circulated pamphlets, a cartoon character named Private Snafu, voiced by none other than Mel Blanc, the guy behind Bugs Bunny, learns the hard way that chasing women overseas can lead to unfortunate medical consequences. The message was clear. Get frisky, get punished. And punished you would be. Not just medically, but administratively. Contracting a venereal disease could result in loss of pay, forced hospitalization, and lectures that made basic training look fun by comparison. There was even a term for it. Non-battle casualty. That's right. You could be listed as wounded in action because of a particularly bad night out. But the weirdest part of all this? While they warned you about what not to do, they didn't exactly offer you a clear idea of what you could do. There was no healthy, honest conversation about desire. No mention of what to do with the very real hunger that built up during months without touch, privacy, or emotional connection. You were told to stay morally fit, but never how to carry your aching body through a war zone without losing your mind. And that made everything harder, literally sometimes. Historians still argue whether these materials were effective at all, or if they just pushed soldiers into darker corners, filled with shame and secrecy. Some say they helped curb disease rates. Others argue they simply made everyone more anxious, more confused, and more prone to risky behavior. But whatever side you believe, there's no denying this. The military's sexual education approach was deeply tangled in moral panic. They didn't just want you healthy, they wanted you pure. This was especially clear in how they described women, particularly foreign women. One pamphlet handed out to American troops in the Pacific warned that native women may appear friendly, but many are infected. Not a whisper about culture, or consent, or compassion. Just a warning label slapped on every unfamiliar face. This attitude fed into a larger narrative that sex outside of marriage, especially abroad, was dangerous, immoral, and potentially treasonous. The implication was that real American men would wait, would write letters, would save themselves for apple pie, baseball, and someone back home in curlers. But come on, you're surrounded by testosterone, bullets, and boredom. Telling you to keep everything zipped up for decency's sake was like telling a starving man not to think about food. So, you faked it. You nodded through the lectures, you joked about the pamphlets, but the ache didn't go away, and neither did the confusion. For some, this moral muddle became internalized. You wanted something warm, something soft, but every message around you said that was wrong, that it made you weak, that it could kill you. So you stuffed those feelings into the same internal pocket where you hid your fear and homesickness. You'd deal with them later. You'd see guys get quiet after these talks. Not ashamed exactly, but uncertain. There were few places to ask honest questions. You couldn't talk to your commanding officer. You definitely couldn't talk to the chaplain. And so instead, soldiers turned to each other. There were late-night conversations, whispered under blankets or behind latrines. Have you ever? What if? Do you think she'd wait for me? You learned more from a bunkmate's awkward story than you ever did from an official guidebook. Some units handled things differently. A few commanders quietly brought in outside medical professionals to give less judgmental talks. In rare cases, they allowed soldiers to ask anonymous questions. These were considered radical moves. Others doubled down on discipline. One sergeant was known to hold up confiscated photos of local women during inspection and ridicule his men for slipping up. One guy lost weekend leave privileges because someone suspected he'd been seen holding hands with a civilian. Not even kissing, just hands. That fear, it shaped everything. But desire doesn't dissolve under fear. It finds new ways to surface. One soldier kept a secret journal where he wrote daily fantasies. Nothing explicit, just memories of his girlfriend's hair, the scent of her skin after summer rain. He said it helped him sleep. Another guy made detailed drawings of imagined lovers, clothed in 1940s movie star glam, but with eyes that looked exactly like someone he missed. None of this made it into the pamphlets. None of this would have been considered healthy conduct, but it was survival. And then there was the unspoken reality. For all the military's warnings, sexual encounters still happened. Frequently. Some were tender, some were transactional, some were regrettable, some unforgettable. But all of them defied the idea that you could sterilize a war down to maps and medals. So what did you do with that thin gray booklet? You skimmed it, laughed at the outdated drawings, passed it to the next guy in line. Maybe you folded it in half and shoved it into your pack to collect dust with that half-eaten chocolate bar and spare laces. You didn't need a manual to tell you that longing didn't make you weak. It just made you human. You're leaning against a makeshift wall of sandbags, flicking a pebble between your boots. When someone mentions the house on the corner, you know exactly what they mean. Everyone does. It's not officially marked on any map, and the MPs pretend it doesn't exist, but it does. Always does. In every town the army settles in for more than a week, there's a version of it. A house, a tent, sometimes even a truck. A red lamp glowing faintly from the window. A line of quiet, shuffling men outside. A door that creaks open and shuts like clockwork. Let's not be coy. You've stumbled into the chapter where military regulation meets desire head-on. The regulated brothel. Mainstream fact. The U.S. military didn't officially condone prostitution, but in several occupied or allied countries, It tolerated or even coordinated with local authorities to ensure safe sexual outlets for its troops. The goal? Control venereal disease and reduce unsanctioned distractions. In practice, it was a mess of moral contradictions and quiet allowances. You're issued a condom. You're told not to go. You're told if you go, be careful. Then you hear someone whisper that there's a doctor doing checkups on the girls every week, so it's clean, whatever that means. The MPs don't stop the line. The chaplain frowns but says nothing. The sergeant shrugs and says, "Better there than with some back alley stranger." Everyone pretends this strange, silent agreement makes sense. But what does it actually feel like stepping through that door? Let's slow it down. The wallpaper is faded. The lamp casts soft orange light that makes everyone look like old newsprint. A woman sits on a chair by the door, reading a French magazine. Another leans against the wall, adjusting a stocking. She sees you, smiles. Not a seductive smile, more like a weary one. You realize then that this isn't glamour, it's a business. She asks your name, not because she needs it, but because it fills the silence. Historians still argue whether these regulated brothels actually reduced disease transmission, or whether they simply created a facade of control over something inherently chaotic. The data's murky. But what's clear is this. The military wanted to manage desire, and when it couldn't suppress it, it redirected it. In some parts of France and Italy, local governments, sometimes under the nudge of Allied forces, set up systems where sex workers were licensed, medically examined, and required to keep logs. That's right, paperwork for passion. In other places, there was no structure, just informal agreements, bribes, and silence. But wherever it happened, the same questions followed. Was it exploitation, protection, both? Quirky tidbit. In the Philippines, during the early part of U.S. occupation, military doctors conducted surprise inspections on local comfort houses. Soldiers reportedly referred to one such building as the Clinic Hotel, where check-in came with a rubber stamp, literally a stamp on a passbook confirming the visit and test result. Talk about a loyalty program. Of course, not every soldier went. Plenty judged those who did. "Real men wait," one corporal muttered once, as he stared into the fire and refused to look at the line forming 50 yards away. Others felt guilt twist in their stomachs, especially the married ones. You might have a photo of your wife in your helmet liner and still find yourself walking toward the red glow like a moth. Desire isn't logical, it doesn't punch a time card, and it doesn't always care about vows, pamphlets, or prayers. There were always stories floating around camp, some bragging, some regretful. She looked like Rita Hayworth. She called me soldatino. I paid her with 2 chocolate bars and a tin of peaches. These weren't romantic tales. They were transactional, almost clinical, but laced with something raw, loneliness. Because that's what most of this came down to. Not lust, not conquest, but aching, clawing loneliness. The kind that sets in when you're surrounded by strangers and steel, and the only touch you've felt in weeks is someone shaking you awake for your watch shift. And so, for some, a visit to the red-lit house wasn't about sin. It was about survival, an hour of pretending to be held, wanted, alive. There's no music inside the house, no silky jazz or soft torch songs. Just the low murmur of conversation, footsteps overhead, a distant laugh. The woman who leads you upstairs doesn't ask questions. She doesn't want your story. You're not here to be known. But maybe that's the hardest part. You start to realize this isn't a movie. There's no passionate kiss, no dramatic sheet pull moment. Just a transaction, a routine. The illusion of intimacy, neatly packaged between military regulations and cultural taboos. And then it's over. You leave with your boots half-tied and a strange feeling in your chest. Not regret exactly, not shame either. Just a hollow space where something soft used to be. Later that night, you lie on your cot and wonder whether you'll write home. You won't. How could you? What would you say? Dear sweetheart, today I learned how it feels to be touched without being seen. Not exactly the letter that gets read aloud in church. The military never asked what it did to a person, to flicker between celibacy and sanctioned release, between craving love and settling for obligation. It just wanted you functional, disease-free, and focused on the mission. Emotions were your problem, but they didn't stay silent forever. Some soldiers wrote about it in post-war memoirs, quietly, cryptically. Others never spoke of it again, tucked the memory deep beneath medals and marriages, letting it fade. Yet for others it became a kind of secret scar, a reminder of how, even in war, desire doesn't disappear. It adapts, it hides, it barges in when you least expect it, and sometimes it waits outside in a quiet line, beneath a red light that never goes out. The waiting room is quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that hovers heavily, thick with unspoken things. You're seated on a worn wooden bench beside two other GIs, neither of whom makes eye contact. The air smells faintly of antiseptic, with just a hint of shame. This isn't the field hospital for shrapnel wounds or busted ankles. This is the venereal disease clinic, and you are not the first to pass through. You'd heard about it for weeks, the murmurs behind tents, the teasing jabs among buddies. Someone would disappear for a few days, come back quieter, different. And now it's you, sitting here, shifting uncomfortably, thinking about her, the girl behind the red curtain, the girl with the laugh, the one who touched your cheek, or maybe the one whose name you never even asked. Either way, you're here. Mainstream fact. Venereal disease was a massive problem during WWII. The U.S. Army reported more than 350,000 cases of syphilis and gonorrhea between 1941 and 1945. That's not counting the unreported ones. Because let's be honest, no soldier wanted to admit he had to be treated down there. You're ushered into a narrow room. A medic, young, tired, not interested in judgment, hands you a paper gown and a look that says, "Let's just get this over with." You comply. The examination is fast, clinical, and cold. Then comes the treatment. Gonorrhea? That means an injection of penicillin if it's available. Syphilis? You might get a cocktail of arsenic-based drugs and mercury ointments. No, really, mercury. The same stuff in thermometers. You're supposed to apply it liberally, though no one tells you what that actually means. Quirky tidbit. Early treatments sometimes included inserting silver nitrate or, brace yourself, caustic sticks into the urethra to disinfect the area. Soldiers joked that it was like punishment from both God and science. Not funny then, still not funny now. You leave the clinic with a packet of pills, a warning not to repeat your mistake, and a quiet sense that you're not entirely human anymore. Like you crossed some invisible line and came out marked. And guess what? That mark is official. You're now tagged as a non-battle casualty. It goes in your file. You might lose pay, you might be reassigned. And if your CO is the preachy type, you might even get a lecture. Some guys wear it like a twisted badge of honor. "Means I got some action," they mutter, grinning through the discomfort. Others crawl inward, afraid to write home, afraid to confess, even to themselves. Because the worst part isn't the burning, it's the knowing. Knowing that while you were chasing comfort, you found consequences. That the brief, flickering moment of warmth now follows you like a shadow, one that won't quite go away. Historians still argue how effective the military's response really was. Did the lectures, posters, and pamphlets actually prevent anything? Or did the culture of silence and shame make it worse? One thing is clear. The soldiers who got infected weren't reckless outliers. They were everyone. They were lonely. They were young. They were human. And the shame? That was government-issued too. You remember seeing the posters. The ones with the sultry silhouettes and blood-red warnings. "She may look clean, but..." Or the infamous one, "VD, not a victimless crime." They made the women into villains, disease vectors, temptresses who lured you off your righteous path. But you don't remember her that way, not at all. She was kind, maybe even scared. Maybe she needed you as much as you needed her. The system didn't have room for that story, though. Later, as you sit on your bunk, legs splayed out, bottle of pills beside your helmet, one of your buddies flops down next to you. Doesn't say anything for a while, just stares at the ceiling. Then, happened to me in Naples, hurt like hell. You nod, and just like that it's a little less heavy, because you realize something. The shame isn't yours. It was built around you, dropped into your kit like an extra grenade. But it doesn't belong to you. Not really. Still, you carry it. Because you're supposed to. Because you were told that desire is a weakness. That your body should be disciplined, like your marching form. That this war isn't the place for human failings. But that's never been true, has it? Wars aren't fought by machines, they're fought by you, with your calloused hands and your fractured thoughts, and your hunger for connection, real, fleeting, flawed connection. So you keep taking the pills. You keep doing your duty. You keep the secret folded deep down, right next to the name you don't speak aloud anymore. Later that week, a chaplain gives a sermon in the mess hall. He talks about temptation, about purity, about God's plan. You sit there, chewing on a spoonful of gray mashed potatoes, and wonder whether God ever walked through a war zone at 3 a.m., needing something more than prayer. You don't raise your hand. The next day, someone in your unit disappears for a few days. No one asks why, but you know. And when he comes back, quieter, different, you offer him your last cigarette without saying a word. Because you've both been there. You've both walked into the clinic and out again, a little more haunted than before. And even now, as the war pushes forward and you're shipped to a new front, the memory of that room, its smell, its silence, its sting, follows you, like a reminder, not just of consequence, but of your own vulnerability, of the quiet, rarely spoken truth that the biggest wounds aren't always visible. They itch, they burn, they linger, and you endure them quietly, like so much else. It's inspection day, and while the lieutenant's busy checking rifle bolts and bedrolls, someone mutters under their breath, "Don't forget to show him your condom." There's a chuckle, then silence, because the joke's not really a joke. You were issued condoms, right alongside your field rations and mess kit. Yes, in your duffel you carry death and protection in the same bag. It's weird, isn't it? Because the message from command is murky at best. On one hand, here's a neat, foil-wrapped piece of latex, your government's way of saying, "We know you're going to do it." On the other hand, here's a stack of lectures, sermons, and moral warnings, saying you really, really shouldn't. Welcome to Section 7, where your body becomes the battlefield for a moral tug-of-war between practicality and purity. Mainstream fact. By 1943, U.S. troops were receiving condoms as part of their preventive kit, especially in overseas postings. Posters at military bases read, "Don't forget. Put it on before you put it in." Yes, really. The military didn't officially encourage premarital sex, but it quietly accepted it as an unavoidable fact of deployment. And so there you were, caught in a paradox. You'd sit through a chaplain's speech about self-control, then walk back to your cot past a hygiene station handing out prophylactics like candy. Don't sin, they'd say. But if you do, wrap it up. It made your head spin, especially when those mixed messages came from the same people. Some commanders were fire and brimstone types who railed against fornication. Others were more practical. One sergeant famously told his unit, "I don't care who you're with, just don't come back itchy." Historians still argue whether this approach, supply but don't sanction, reduced infection rates or simply increased confusion. The condom distribution effort did help curb disease somewhat, but it also created an unspoken rulebook full of contradictions. Do it, don't talk about it, and for heaven's sake, don't get caught, which made everything about sex even more charged, more secret, more strange. Because now, using a condom wasn't just about safety. It was a quiet act of defiance, a way of saying, "I'm going to be human anyway." So how did soldiers actually treat these little government-issued shields? Some carried them religiously. Others forgot them entirely. A few didn't know how to use them. You heard horror stories of condoms being reused, turned inside out, or stored next to mess tins and melting chocolate bars. Hygiene was not always the first concern in a foxhole. Quirky tidbit? In North Africa, the desert heat sometimes caused the rubber to crack or disintegrate in storage. One poor soul used his rationed condom as a water balloon, figuring he'd rather have a laugh than pretend he had a chance at love in 120-degree weather. There were soldiers who made jokes out of it, stretched them over rifle barrels, wore them like party hats during downtime, inflated them like balloons and set them drifting through the barracks. But those were nervous laughs, you could tell. Deep down, nobody really knew how to handle the strange mix of desire, fear, and awkward government oversight. And yet, there were moments when it all faded. A night in a foreign city, a shared drink, a look that turned into a touch. You reached into your pocket, not for your sidearm, not for your dog tags, but for that thin foil square, folded in half. And in that moment, your body felt like it belonged to you again. Not to the army, not to the cause, not to anyone else's rulebook, just yours. But even then, the shame wasn't far behind. You'd return to camp and feel the guilt kick in. What would your mother think? What would your sweetheart say if she knew? You'd stare at your hands and wonder whether you were still the same man who boarded that train back in '42, with a Bible in his bag and a promise on his lips. The truth was, everyone was navigating it in their own way. Some buried the guilt under bravado. Some swallowed it like dry medicine. A few refused to acknowledge it altogether, pretending sex didn't happen unless someone else got caught. But for most of you, it was just one more layer of complexity in a world that had already gone off the rails. A war fought with bullets and bandages and rubber. Sometimes, during downtime, the conversation would shift there. Late-night barracks talk. Not bragging, not teasing, just wondering. Do you think it counts if it's not love? Is it cheating if you don't mean anything by it? Does God understand loneliness? No one had the answers. Not even the guys who acted like they did. The chaplains certainly tried. They'd quote scripture about temptation, about waiting, about purity, but they also looked tired. Like they'd seen too many men trying to pray their way out of shame, and not enough learning how to live with it. One even admitted, quietly only once, that the hardest thing wasn't keeping men physically safe. It was keeping them from turning to hate when they couldn't handle their own hunger. You didn't ask him what he meant, but you felt it, because this wasn't just about sex. It was about control, about identity, about what it meant to be a good soldier when your body refused to be obedient. It was about trying to reconcile who you were with what you needed. So you kept the foil packet tucked in your pack, just in case. Maybe you'd never use it. Maybe you'd use it and feel worse. But it was there. A tiny rubber symbol of the war you were fighting inside yourself. And someday, decades from now, maybe you'll open a forgotten box in the attic and find one, still sealed, yellowed with time. You'll laugh, softly, and shake your head. Not at what you did, but at how hard you tried to do the right thing in a world that never stopped contradicting itself. And maybe, in that small, strange moment, you'll forgive yourself. Because you were never just a soldier, you were a person. A man trying to follow orders, make sense of feelings, and find connection in a place designed to tear everything human apart. And sometimes, that's all it took. A bit of rubber, a bit of rebellion, and a reminder that you still had choices, even in the middle of war. You're lying on your bunk now, boots still on, arms folded behind your head, eyes fixed on the low-hung ceiling of the barracks. The day's done. The noise has quieted. No drills, no mail call, no lectures from the chaplain. Just the soft hum of an overworked generator outside, and the occasional creak of someone rolling over on a squeaky cot nearby. Above you, tacked to the splintered wood beam, is her, Rita Hayworth, Betty Grable, Hedy Lamarr. A dream wrapped in glossy newsprint, pinned there like a talisman. You stare up at her often, not in a crude way, not really. It's not about that. It's about remembering something beautiful, something soft, something still. Because fantasy, massaged, curated, and government-approved, was the Army's favorite form of therapy. Mainstream fact. Pin-up girls were officially embraced by the U.S. military during WWII. The Army distributed magazines and calendars with actresses, models, and beauty queens posed in flirty, but not explicit postures. These images weren't considered distractions. They were morale boosters, approved daydreams, and boy did they work. You weren't supposed to have alcohol. You weren't supposed to have real privacy. You weren't supposed to have sex, at least not openly. But you could have Rita, taped above your bed, smiling like she knew you. She didn't, of course. She probably didn't even know where half of you were stationed, but it didn't matter. Her smile held something your surroundings didn't, intention, and for a few moments, looking up at her while the cold seeped into your boots or the rain thudded against your tent, you felt connected. Not to her, but to the world you left behind, to something gentler. The military knew what it was doing. The pinup wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy, a clean outlet, a sanctioned distraction. Quirky tidbit? Rita Hayworth's 1941 Life magazine photo, where she poses in a negligee on a satin sheet, was one of the most requested images among U.S. troops. By 1943, over 5 million copies had been printed and circulated in barracks, tents, foxholes, and lockers. Some men swore that pinup helped them survive the worst nights. But it wasn't just about the face on the wall. It was everything that came with it. The magazines you passed around, the comic strips tucked under your mattress, the airbrushed world where women always waited, always smiled, and never said no. Fantasy became its own kind of ration, not issued in tins or boxes, but in daydreams. You could see it at any given downtime. One guy would be lying on his back, eyes glazed, mumbling about what he'd do if he were back in Hollywood, maybe sweeping Rita off her feet in some post-war bar. Another would sketch a silhouette in the margin of a letter, a swirl of hips and curls, just for himself. Nobody said anything, because we all did it, you included. There's an unspoken etiquette about it. Where the line is, how far you're allowed to drift. You might make a comment, a harmless joke, something half-suggestive. Your buddies laugh, then silence again. Because the line between levity and loneliness is thin. So thin you could paper the wall with it. And still, as much as these images comforted you, they also complicated things. Because how could anyone at home live up to that? The girls you'd left behind didn't pose in silk or blow kisses from magazine pages. They were tired, working long hours, waiting, writing letters they weren't sure would ever arrive. You started comparing without meaning to, and that gap, the one between fantasy and real life, started to stretch. Some men stopped writing altogether, convinced their relationships couldn't survive reality. Others poured more affection into their letters than ever, trying to blur the lines. I dream about you in red, one soldier wrote. Like the dress you wore that night. I see you, picture perfect every time I close my eyes. Was it honest? Maybe not, but it was necessary. Fantasy didn't just help you escape, it helped you preserve something, even if that something wasn't quite true. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of pinups during wartime. Did they help reduce stress and ease sexual frustration? Or did they distort expectations, fostering unhealthy ideas about women, intimacy, and what home really meant? Like most wartime tools, they served a function, but the emotional residue lingered. And let's not forget, this wasn't all harmless. Pinups also reinforced a narrow version of beauty, white, thin, young, and always available. For many soldiers, especially men of color, the fantasy on the wall didn't look like the women back home, or the ones they were fighting beside. It was yet another reminder of who got to be idolized and who didn't. Even so, soldiers made their own images. Some drew their wives, sketching from memory. Others kept homemade photos in lockets, tucked behind dog tags. A few crafted paper collages, faces from home pasted onto movie star bodies, a kind of dream forging made with scissors and glue. It's messy when you really look at it, this whole arrangement. But that's war. Messy, contradictory human. You roll over in your bunk. Someone nearby snores. A page flutters in the wind. The corner of a calendar. June 1944. The day circled in pencil. Maybe D-Day. Maybe your birthday. You look up one more time. She's still there. Still smiling. Still perfect. And for now, that's enough. Tomorrow, you'll lace up your boots. Tomorrow, you'll march. Tomorrow, you'll fight. But tonight you're 19, staring at a photo taped above your head, dreaming of skin softer than wool and days quieter than this. You reach up and touch the corner of the paper just briefly, and then finally, you drift off. The rain won't stop. It's been 3 days now, and everything is damp. Your socks, your rucksack, even the pack of cigarettes you've been saving for something that feels like hope. You're stuck in a tent with 7 other guys. The air thick with body odor, boredom, and the occasional outburst of laughter that comes out of nowhere and dies just as fast. And when the bullets aren't flying and the mud isn't rising, do you know what fills the silence? Talk. Not the kind of talk you have at roll call, or with your CO, or when the chaplain comes by with that forced smile. No, this is a different kind. This is the language of barracks banter, where desire, fantasy, and raw speculation swirl into something half real, half ridiculous. Welcome to the fantasy escape. You lean back on your gear, close your eyes, and listen. Someone's telling a story. It's about a girl in Naples, red dress, soft voice, lips like strawberries. Someone else jumps in, claims he met twins in Marseille who couldn't keep their hands to themselves. The guy in the corner snorts and says they're both lying through their teeth. But even he smiles, because the truth doesn't matter much here. It's not about what happened. It's about what could have. Mainstream fact. Boredom was one of the greatest threats to morale during World War II. When soldiers weren't in combat or on assignment, they often had hours, sometimes days, of nothing to do. And in those moments, talking about women, sex, and imagined adventures became a kind of coping mechanism, a shared, whispered escape hatch. It wasn't always graphic. Often it was just absurd. Elaborate tales of secret rendezvous, overheard stories from other units. One guy claimed he'd been offered marriage by a barmaid after buying her a drink and reciting Shakespeare. Another swore he'd fallen in love during a 30-minute train ride and still got letters from her every month. No one believed him. He still read those letters aloud. Historians still argue whether these stories were primarily about escapism or if they reflected deeper emotional needs soldiers couldn't safely express. Was it about lust, love, or just needing to believe that something soft, something kind, still existed beyond the mud? You'd hear the same names over and over. Lana Turner, Ava Gardner, Betty Grable. They became shorthand for desire, the dream girls of an entire generation. What would you do if Ava walked in right now, someone might say, and the tent would burst into suggestions, laughter, maybe a few groans. But it wasn't just celebrities. Sometimes it was real people. A high school sweetheart, a nurse from the aid station, the girl in the photo you kept tucked in your helmet liner. She had a name, but in the barracks, she became an idea, a symbol, a safe place to return to when everything else felt like chaos. Quirky tidbit? Some soldiers created full-blown fantasy journals, diaries not of the war, but of imagined flings, flirtations, even long-distance romances with women they'd never met. One such journal, found in a footlocker decades later, included fake addresses, made-up responses, and detailed imaginary dates. A private universe scribbled out in pencil, just to stay sane. And sometimes things got weird. Rumors would spread, some believable, some bizarre. A soldier once claimed to have received perfume-scented underwear in a care package. Someone else said he knew a guy who got a lock of hair from a woman he'd never met, with a note that just read, "Think of me." You'd roll your eyes, you'd laugh. But when the lights were out, you'd imagine it too. Fantasy wasn't about being accurate. It was about being anywhere else. Because in the quiet, when the tent stopped rustling and the gunfire was distant, your brain would drift, inevitably, to something warmer than war. Maybe it was the kiss you never got before deployment. Maybe it was the dance you swore you'd have when you returned. Maybe it was just the idea of someone wanting you, missing you, needing you. And those thoughts, they were survival tools. Just like helmets, just like boots. Because without them the nights got too long. You weren't alone in this. Even the guys who acted too tough for romance had their tells. One guy sharpened his knife every night and muttered under his breath. But once you saw him fold a letter like it was gold. Another kept a sketch of a woman inside his pack, worn soft from touch. He never talked about her. No one asked. In this strange ecosystem of masculinity, feelings weren't shared. They were coded, buried inside jokes, hidden between stories, wrapped in sarcasm. But they were there, and every once in a while, something broke through. Like the time the unit cook found an old piano in a bombed-out building and played a lullaby so sad that even the grunts stopped talking. Someone whispered, "My mother used to hum that," and no one said anything after that for a long while. That's how it went. Fantasies weren't just distractions. They were defenses, shields against the void, soft things in a hard world. And every now and then, someone crossed the line. You remember the private who built a shrine to a girl from back home. Letters, photos, a pressed flower in a ration tin. His buddies laughed. Then one day he got a Dear John, tore it all down, threw the flower into the fire, went silent for a week. He wasn't the same after that. You understood, because fantasy is fragile. When it breaks, you feel it like shrapnel. So you learn to tend it gently, to let it flicker without getting too close. You picture her face, but not too clearly. You imagine her voice, but not the words. You hold just enough to comfort yourself, not enough to get burned. And tonight, as the rain continues to tap on the canvas roof like fingers on glass, someone starts another story. It's a wild one, probably false, definitely embellished. You close your eyes, let the voices fade into rhythm, and imagine you're back home, sitting at a booth in some quiet diner, her hand resting on yours. The jukebox plays something slow. No bombs, no uniforms, just coffee and laughter, and the scent of someone who missed you. And even though it's not real, it feels real. And for tonight, that's enough. You're waking up before sunrise again. Not for combat, just routine. Same breakfast, same formations. Same unspoken fatigue, etched across the faces around you. But today, there's something else in the air. Something unspoken, coiled tightly between looks and gestures. It's not about what's happening, it's about what isn't being said. You feel it in the lingering glances, the too long silences, the way some men sit just a little closer during downtime, even when there's space to spread out. This one's about the other side of desire, the quiet, forbidden kind, the kind that doesn't get pinned to a barracks wall or written about in censored letters. It's about same-sex affection, intimacy in a world that didn't allow for it, at least not openly. You wouldn't call it that word, though, not here, not then. But it existed. Oh, it existed. Mainstream fact. Homosexual acts were criminalized across all Allied military services during WWII. In the U.S. military, it could lead to dishonorable discharge, imprisonment, or worse. And yet, in the chaos of war, where men lived shoulder to shoulder, slept inches apart, and held each other up through horror and heartbreak, emotional and even physical closeness often blurred into something more. You didn't talk about it, of course, that would be dangerous. But you felt it, that bunkmate who always volunteered to go on watch with you. The one whose hand brushed yours just a little too long during a cigarette pass. The private who met your eyes across the barracks and held your gaze just a heartbeat too long. It wasn't always sexual. It wasn't even always romantic. Sometimes it was just affection, pure and quiet and necessary. A tenderness you couldn't ask for, but sometimes received anyway. The war stripped away a lot. Comfort, safety, privacy, but it also stripped away pretense. And when you've seen someone sobbing after a firefight, when you've had to bandage their wounds with shaking hands, When you've held them upright after they nearly bled out, something changes. You love them. Maybe not the way the world wants you to. Maybe not the way you understand it yet. But the feeling is there, pressed tight between ribs and regulation. Historians still argue about how prevalent same-sex relationships or encounters were among soldiers in WWII. Documentation is scarce, often coded, and frequently redacted. But oral histories, hidden journals, and late-life memoirs suggest that emotional intimacy, whether expressed physically or not, was more common than the official record allows, because war, for all its violence, creates strange spaces for softness, and in those spaces rules start to blur. Quirky tidbit? In one British unit, soldiers passed around a copy of The Well of Loneliness, a banned lesbian novel, tucked inside a Bible sleeve. No one talked about it, but the book kept reappearing in different hands, like a silent confession being shared. Back in your own unit, it starts quietly, a quiet word before sleep, a back rub after a long march, a joke that turns into a look that turns into a pause. You don't plan it, you don't name it. But one night, lying on your side under the stars, your breath visible in the cold air, his hand finds yours in the dark. You don't pull away. There's nothing said, nothing needs to be, because in that moment, what matters isn't the word you're afraid to say. It's the warmth, the safety, the relief of being touched in a way that isn't clinical or regulated or paid for. Just real. You don't kiss. There's no fireworks, just fingertips. A closeness you didn't know you needed until you had it. And the next day, everything's back to normal, or looks that way. He doesn't mention it. Neither do you. But something lingers in the air. A trust, maybe. Or a shared secret. And you carry it with you, quietly, beneath your uniform and between your thoughts. But you're not stupid, you know the risks. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, one unlucky eavesdropper, that's all it would take, and everything would collapse. Because while the military might look the other way when it comes to a quick visit to the house with the red lamp, it draws the line, harshly, at anything that blurs the lines of masculinity it built into doctrine. You've heard the stories, a corporal reassigned to kitchen duty after a whispered rumor, a private dishonorably discharged and sent home in disgrace, a pair of medics caught holding hands behind the latrine. No one knows what happened to them after. The army didn't tolerate softness unless it was framed in grief. You could cry over a buddy, you could hug your friend after a close call, but anything else? That was a danger. Not to the mission, just to the myth of what a soldier was supposed to be. And so you kept it buried, or maybe you didn't. Maybe one night, fear gave way to need, and you crossed a line you thought you never would. And maybe you never did it again, but you remember how alive you felt, how seen. Because in that moment, you weren't just part of a machine. You were a human being with a heartbeat and hands that ached to be held. And maybe it wasn't love, or maybe it was. You didn't have the words, but you had the memory. You still do. And years later, when you're sitting on your porch or lying in bed, unable to sleep, that memory drifts in, quietly, kindly. He didn't judge you. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask you to be anything other than what you were. And in a world that asked you to carry so much, to kill on command, to live without softness, that moment was everything. So no, it doesn't show up in the records. No medals were given, no names remembered. But it was real. And in the middle of a war built on control, chaos, and fear, a moment of gentle connection, that might have been the bravest thing you ever did. You sit on a folding bench in a canvas tent that smells like coffee, damp wool, and cheap disinfectant. A Bible sits on a crate turned into a makeshift podium. It's Sunday, or something close to it. Days blur, especially out here. The chaplain's clearing his throat, flipping through pages, preparing to speak. You shift on the bench. It's cold, your socks are wet, and your stomach's still turning from last night's rations. But here you are, sitting, waiting. Another sermon is about to begin. This one's not about strategy or strength or sacrifice. It's about morality, about purity, about the war inside. He starts gently enough. talking about faith, about keeping hope alive, about writing home. But soon the tone shifts. There's talk of temptation, of sin, of bodies as battlegrounds for more than bullets. And slowly, the message becomes clear. Don't just fight the enemy out there, fight the one in here. The chaplain gestures toward his chest. But you know where he really means. You sit a little straighter. You've heard this speech before. Mainstream fact. Military chaplains in WWII were tasked not just with offering spiritual support, but with maintaining moral fitness among troops. They preach sermons on sexual restraint, purity, and discipline, and often framed these as vital to winning the war. A weak body could falter in combat. A weak spirit could falter in character. Of course, not every chaplain delivered fire and brimstone. Some were gentle, thoughtful, even a little understanding, but many leaned hard into guilt, describing the war as righteous and warning that impure acts, especially sexual ones, could endanger not just your soul, but the entire unit's mission. No pressure, right? It's strange, being told that your private urges are a national threat. The chaplain keeps speaking. He says the body is a gift, that it's sacred, that using it outside of God's design dishonors both yourself and your nation. You glance down at your hands, same ones that carried a rifle through the mud last week, that pulled a wounded friend to cover, that held a stranger close for one warm night in Belgium. Are those hands sinful? You're not sure anymore. Historians still argue whether this kind of moral messaging helped soldiers stay grounded, or whether it simply amplified shame, confusion, and emotional repression. There's no simple answer. For some, sermons were anchors. For others, shackles. The war wanted your body, but the sermons wanted your soul. And if you gave in to desire, if you held someone too long, kissed someone too deeply, even touched yourself in the quiet hours of night, you carried the weight of that guilt into every sunrise. Some soldiers confessed. Others stayed quiet, letting the shame throb beneath their thoughts like an injury you can't quite find. One man in your unit, let's call him Harris, used to sit through every sermon with eyes closed, head bowed. Afterward, he'd write letters for hours. You thought he was just homesick. Then one day, you saw what he was writing. Prayers, pages and pages, pleas for forgiveness. He'd been to the red light house once, maybe twice, and he couldn't let it go. Quirky tidbit? In one unit, soldiers created a secret absolution board in the latrine, a piece of plywood where you could scrawl your sins in chalk and then erase them. Some wrote things like, "Looked too long at that nurse," or "Touched myself during night watch." A crude joke? Maybe. Or maybe just a desperate way to release what the sermons built up. The contradiction was crushing. You were told to feel, but only the right feelings. Love for your country, hate for the enemy, respect for your uniform. Everything else, desire, loneliness, lust, had to be contained, reshaped, repented. But you weren't a priest. You were a soldier, a kid, really, trying to survive. So you sat there, Sunday after Sunday, listening, nodding when you were supposed to, folding your hands when they told you to pray, hoping that your body wouldn't betray you, that the memory of the girl in Marseille, or the guy who touched your hand too long, wouldn't rise up and burn your conscience raw. Because the military said protect your body, the chaplain said protect your soul, but no one ever told you how to do both. You remember one sermon in particular. He read from a letter written by a soldier who died last week. Said he'd fought the good fight and kept himself pure. The chaplain's voice cracked. Some guys cried. You didn't. You couldn't. All you could think was, what if he wasn't pure? What if he'd kissed someone, touched someone, whispered something he wasn't supposed to? Would his sacrifice mean less? Would his name still be read out loud? The war was full of rules, but none of them accounted for being human. And so, you carried it all with you. The sermons, the shame, the questions you didn't dare ask. They hung in your throat, in your sleep, in your pulse. But not always, because for every moment of guilt, there was a moment of resistance. You'd laugh with your buddies, You'd tell a joke that pushed the line. You'd hum a love song under your breath. You'd close your eyes and imagine a night that ended in warmth, not warning. You'd hold on to your humanity piece by piece. And maybe that was your real rebellion. Not ignoring the sermons, but surviving them. Not silencing your desires, but carrying them through the fire and still being kind. Because despite everything they told you, every line about sin and purity, you never stopped being a person. And maybe, just maybe, that was the holiest thing of all. The war is winding down. Not quite over, not yet. But something's shifted. You can feel it. The rumors are louder, the letters a little more hopeful, the gunfire more distant. Even the way people walk has changed. Less urgency, more pause, as if everyone's starting to remember there might be a life beyond all this. But you're thinking about something else entirely. Because the latest letter from home doesn't open with, "I miss you." It opens with, "We need to talk." Your stomach drops. You read the rest, eyes scanning each line faster than your brain can keep up. There it is. She's pregnant. She's not sure. It might be yours. It might not be. She wants to do the right thing. She hopes you understand. You fold the letter slowly, like maybe if you press the edges tight enough, it'll all go away. Welcome to one of the quietest battlefronts of the war. The one back home. The one where pregnancies, rushed weddings, and a storm of silence changed lives before boots even hit the ground again. Mainstream fact. World War II saw a significant rise in what were euphemistically called wartime marriages. Between 1942 and 1945, marriage rates in the U.S. hit historic highs, with countless couples tying the knot quickly, some after just days or even hours of knowing each other. Often the wedding came after a missed period, or right before deployment, sometimes both. And just as quickly as those ceremonies happened, so did the complications. You hear the stories in passing. A guy in your unit gets quiet after mail call. Someone else tears up a photo. A few disappear and come back with silver rings they didn't have last week. There's always a look in their eyes, not shame, not quite, but something between dread and determination. Back home, everything's moving fast. War has a way of speeding up clocks. Some women found themselves alone with swelling bellies and no promises. Others walked down the aisle with men they barely knew, clutching shaky vows like parachutes. And for every happy ending, there were 2 or 3 that didn't survive past VE Day. Historians still argue whether these wartime unions were acts of love, survival, or social pressure. In truth, they were probably a mix of all 3. Some marriages became lifelong partnerships. Others crumbled under the weight of absence, trauma, and unmet expectations. For soldiers, the emotions were just as tangled. Some rushed to propose the moment they got leave. Some asked over letter. Some didn't ask at all, only found out later that someone else had stepped in. A local guy, a factory foreman, a cousin's friend from church. And then there were the pregnancies. You may not have talked about it much, maybe not at all, but everyone knew. Stories passed like smokes behind tents. A buddy's girl expecting, a quiet wedding rushed through before leave ended, a baby born with no father in sight. You remember one letter in particular, not yours, your bunkmate's. He opened it, blinked, reread it 3 times, and whispered, "She's naming him after me." Then he just stared at the wall for an hour. Did he love her? Maybe. Had he seen her in person since basic? No. But that baby suddenly became more real than his rifle. Quirky tidbit. Some military bases created makeshift wedding corners, complete with borrowed flowers, army bands, and chaplains on standby, ready to marry couples on 48-hour passes. Photos from the time show soldiers in uniform and women in hastily borrowed dresses, smiling under paper streamers. A celebration, a countdown, a gamble. Of course, not everyone got a wedding. Some women chose not to write, not to name the father. Some never even told the soldier at all. Others wrote heartbreaking letters asking for help, for answers, for support, and sometimes received only silence in return. And the military? It tried to stay out of it. These weren't combat matters. But behind the scenes, there were protocols. Paperwork for dependents. Leave requests, denied or granted, based on domestic complications. Chaplains assigned to counsel young couples, and, when necessary, officiate funerals for newborns who never met their fathers. You might not have had the words for it then, but you were living through a quiet epidemic. The collision of war, sex, secrecy, and consequence. And it wasn't just women back home. In occupied territories, similar stories played out. Relationships, real or fleeting, led to pregnancies. Some women hoped their soldier would stay. Others begged him to leave and never come back. In a few rare cases, the military facilitated adoptions or immigration petitions. But more often, those children grew up with stories instead of fathers. You think about this late at night, about the woman whose hands you held, whose breath warmed your neck, whose name you may not even remember, but whose life might now carry a part of yours. You don't talk about this with the others. It feels too raw, too uncertain, but it weighs on you. Not guilt exactly, something else. A quiet wondering, a lifetime of what-ifs. Would you have stayed? Could you have loved her, back home or in some foreign village? Would she even want you to? These aren't the kind of questions you bring up during chow or while cleaning your rifle, but they're there. They linger when the camp falls quiet, when the mail's late, when someone else gets a letter that makes him fold into himself, silent and small. You begin to realize that the end of war doesn't mean the end of confusion. Because what you're returning to, it's not the world you left. There are promises waiting, and broken ones too. There are women wearing rings for men who never made it back. Others raising children with last names chosen from memory or kindness, not marriage. And maybe, just maybe, someone will be waiting for you. With questions, with hope, or with a child in her arms. And you'll stand there, duffel over one shoulder, trying to remember who you were when you left, trying to decide who you want to be now. You're back on the road, boots on cobblestones, rifle slung low, duffel cutting into your shoulder. The air smells like bread and wood smoke, the kind of smell that makes you pause, even after all this time. You're in a quiet town, somewhere that doesn't quite hate you, doesn't quite trust you either. But someone's waiting there. She leans against the doorway of a narrow house, her hair's pulled back, sleeves rolled, face unreadable. She doesn't smile, but she doesn't turn away either. This is the part they don't show in the movies. The moment after the goodbye never quite happens. You'd promised to write. Maybe you did. Once, twice. Maybe not at all, but you meant it, at least at the time. This chapter. It's about what happens when war love outlives its battlefield. Occupied hearts, abandoned lovers. The silent aftermath of promises you made with your hands but couldn't carry in your duffel. Mainstream fact. During and after WWII, thousands of romantic relationships bloomed between Allied soldiers and civilians in war-torn regions, especially in France, Italy, Germany, and the Philippines. Some led to marriage and immigration. Many more ended with silence, heartbreak, and questions that never got answered. You remember her laugh more than her name. The way she poured your coffee like it meant something. The scarf she wore in the rain. The little phrases you picked up in her language. Just enough to say you cared, not enough to explain why you left. She told you not to promise anything. You did anyway. She told you not to lie. You didn't, not on purpose. But it turns out not lying and telling the truth aren't always the same thing. You were young, she was lonely, or maybe it was the other way around. And now, walking through this half-rebuilt town with your boots echoing in alleys that once held secrets, you wonder what's worse, not going back at all, or going back too late. Historians still argue how many soldiers actually intended to return to their wartime partners, and how many simply wanted to believe they could. Immigration data shows that over 100,000 war brides were brought to the U.S. between 1942 and 1952, but that's a fraction of the relationships that began. Most ended in silence, folded into the fog of return, and the women, they remembered. Some waited, some didn't. Some married local men and raised children who looked just a little bit like someone who left in uniform and never came back. Some raised those children alone. Quirky tidbit. In post-war France, children born to American GIs were sometimes referred to as les enfants de la guerre, war babies. In Germany, some communities referred to them as occupation kids. Many were raised without knowing their fathers' names, just holding on to a photograph or a name written phonetically in a diary. And here's the part that still stings. You thought about her. Not every day. Not in the trenches or under fire. But in those quiet mornings when the mist clung to your tent flap. In the weeks after the ceasefire. When the orders were slowing down and the future was suddenly a thing you had to think about again. You thought about her laugh. Her room above the bakery. The way she looked at you like you hadn't just seen the world fall apart. But you didn't write. You told yourself it would be better that way. Cleaner, easier. What would you say anyway? Sorry for the silence. I remember you every time it rains. You convinced yourself she was fine, that someone else had stepped in, that she'd let go just like you had to. You were half right. Some love doesn't burn. It simmers, soft, steady, long after the goodbye. And maybe it wasn't love. Maybe it was convenience. A quiet deal between two people who needed comfort more than commitment. But even that has its weight. You see her now, older, not much, just a little. There's a child playing near the steps, not yours. Or maybe it could have been. You raise your hand but you don't wave. She doesn't look surprised, just tired. You nod, she nods, and that's the end of it. Except it's not. Because later that night, in a camp miles away, you can't sleep. You stare at the canvas roof and think about how some goodbyes never land clean. They stretch across years. They haunt old photos. They echo in songs you haven't heard since the barracks. You think of the girl in the Philippines, the one in Milan, the widow in Luxembourg who kissed your hand and never asked your name. They say war makes everything more intense. But what they don't say is that it also makes everything more temporary. Emotions bloom fast and die faster. But sometimes, just sometimes, they root deep, whether you want them to or not. And you carry them, not openly, not in your duffel, not in your letters, but in the corners of your mind, in the half-dreams that find you when the night watch is quiet and your body finally stops moving. You don't know if they remember you, but you remember them. Not for what they gave you, but for what they let you be. Not a soldier, not a weapon, not a uniform. Just a person, for a moment. In their room, at their table, in their arms. And if that's not love, what is? Someone's missing from morning roll call. You notice it first when his bunk stays made. Blanket folded just a little too neatly. No boots under the frame. No gear slumped against the wall. The guys don't say anything. At least not yet. You all learned early that silence moves faster than gossip. But by noon, it's confirmed. Court-martial. Something about indecency. You don't know the details. No one ever really does. But the rumors start anyway. They always do. Welcome to the quiet policing of passion. The way the military cracked down on behavior it couldn't control, didn't understand, or simply feared. It was never just about following orders. It was about following expectations, unwritten rules about who you could touch, what you could feel, and what parts of yourself had to stay locked down tight. Mainstream fact. During WWII, the U.S. military routinely discharged soldiers for acts deemed sexually deviant or morally unfit, including homosexuality, adultery, or solicitation. These discharges, especially blue discharges, a vague category between honorable and dishonorable, left thousands of veterans without benefits and marked with permanent social stigma. And it wasn't just about who you slept with. It was how you acted. Too many letters, too much perfume, a photo on your cot that wasn't a Hollywood starlet. Even affection that passed beyond the unspoken masculine code could get you noticed. There wasn't always a warning. One day you're laughing over rations and the next someone's gone. A quiet disappearance, tucked behind paperwork no one sees. You ask the lieutenant where they went. He says, transferred, then walks away. Historians still argue how much of this was systemic. and how much was paranoia trickling down the ranks. Some say it was coordinated, part of a military-wide effort to enforce heterosexual, masculine norms. Others argue it was a patchwork of personal biases and command-level overreactions. Either way, the outcome was the same: fear. The kind of fear that made you second-guess how long you looked someone in the eye. You remember one soldier, tough, quiet, wrote poetry on the back of ration cartons. Most thought it was harmless, until someone found one with a man's name. Next day, gone. No goodbye, just an empty bunk and a bad silence. Quirky tidbit? Some soldiers reportedly developed code languages to communicate desire or affection without getting caught. One popular method was inserting phrases from classic literature into letters, Shakespearean sonnets, lines from Whitman or Wilde, hoping the censors would miss the meaning. It wasn't foolproof, but it was better than silence. But not everyone got to be subtle. Women in the auxiliary corps faced their own policing, accused of moral misconduct for everything from being seen alone with a man to receiving too many letters from the same one. In some cases, entire units of nurses were shipped home after rumors circulated about their behavior, regardless of truth, and no one was watching the watchers. MPs patrolled not just the gates and town bars, but desire itself, deciding who looked suspicious, who lingered too long at the wrong corner, who failed to meet the impossible standard of straight-backed, straight-faced discipline. And for those who stepped outside the lines, there were consequences, not always legal, sometimes just isolation. Teasing that crossed into threats. Jokes laced with warning. You start noticing who doesn't get invited to poker night anymore, who sits alone at meals, who gets left behind when the group goes into town. You see it happen, and you stay quiet. Because what else can you do? You tell yourself it's not your business, that you don't know the full story, that they probably broke some rule you don't understand, that it's not your fight. But late at night, lying in your bunk, the question creeps in. What if it were you? What if the letters you tucked under your shirt were found? What if the moment you brushed someone's hand was noticed? What if a look lasted 1 second too long? You start to carry your loneliness more carefully. You laugh louder when others do. You talk about girls you never met. You keep your eyes low and your voice even, not because you're ashamed, but because you know what happens to those who aren't careful. The system's not just built to punish, it's built to erase. And it works, not because it silences everyone, but because it convinces you to silence yourself. You think about the men who vanished, the women reassigned, the names never read aloud at memorials, the goodbyes never spoken. You wonder if they still remember you. You hope they do, because you remember them. You remember the way they smiled, the way they laughed, the way they carried too much too quietly. And someday, maybe, when you're older, sitting with grandkids or just staring out at a dusty afternoon from a porch, you'll find their names in your mind again. Maybe you'll finally say them, not with shame, but with the reverence reserved for the brave, because they were brave, braver than you. They lived truth quietly in a world that only accepted lies. They loved even when love was outlawed. And while the military could police letters, photos, and glances, it couldn't erase the fact that even in the middle of a war, some people chose connection over conformity, even if it cost them everything. It's quieter now. The uniforms are packed away, the rations long gone. The war, your war, is over, officially at least. But inside, something's still buzzing, like a motor that forgot how to turn off. You sit on your porch with a warm drink in hand. The air smells like earth after rain, and a dog barks somewhere down the road. Kids play stickball in the distance. Somewhere, someone is cooking dinner. And yet, you're not quite here, because your body came home, but pieces of you are still scattered across a dozen towns and 100 restless nights. This chapter isn't about desire in the moment. It's about what desire becomes when the dust settles, when you're not private anyone anymore, when the echo of longing turns into memory, and memory turns into a question mark. Did it all matter? Did she? Did they? Did you? Mainstream fact. After WWII, many veterans struggled to reconcile their wartime experiences with post-war life. The transition wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and moral. Some buried their memories, others romanticized them. A few never stopped living in the middle of it all, and for some, what lingered most wasn't the combat. It was the desire. The small, stolen moments of connection, the touches, the promises, the lips that trembled against theirs in the dark before dawn. You don't talk about it much. Not with your spouse. Not with your grown kids. Definitely not with the guys at the hardware store who trade war stories like baseball cards. Because your story? It's complicated. There was the girl in Italy who walked you home barefoot through olive groves. The nurse who sat with you after the shelling, hand on yours, saying nothing. The boy who kissed you in secret and left before you could say anything back. You don't forget them. But memory's a strange thing. It smooths the edges, softens the facts. Sometimes it even rewrites them. And slowly, what was once urgent and electric becomes something else. Something almost sweet. Historians still argue whether veterans' post-war nostalgia reflects truth or coping. Did soldiers really fall in love in the mud and rubble? Or is that what they needed to believe later, when the world became too quiet, too clean, too structured? Maybe it doesn't matter, because even if those moments weren't tidy or lasting or even healthy, they were real. Real enough to tattoo themselves on your mind. Some nights you still feel it. The way your heart used to race when you received a letter. The heat of a hand slipped into yours beneath the camouflage netting. The feel of someone's breath on your neck in a city you never learned how to pronounce. It's all still there, just hidden, folded deep between the welcome home banners and the mortgage and the silence that followed. Quirky tidbit. In the 1960s, a few retired WWII veterans began anonymously publishing memoirs and short stories detailing their wartime relationships. Some with women, some with men. Some that defied all tidy categories. Many used pseudonyms. Most were ignored. But a few quietly sparked conversations in university reading rooms and veterans' halls, long before the world was ready to listen. And now, as the world turns faster, you wonder who will remember. Not just the battles, but the arms that held you afterward, the laughter, the longing, the guilt, the tenderness, the ache. Will anyone ever tell those stories? You hope so, because desire was a war of its own. Fought without medals or uniforms. No parades for those who waited. No honors for the broken-hearted. But the courage it took, that deserves remembering. You sip your drink. Watch the sun dip lower. Feel the ache in your knees and the warmth in your chest that hasn't gone out. Not really. And you smile. Not because it was easy, but because it was. And that's enough. Let it all quiet down now. Let the porch creak beneath your weight. Let the hum of distant voices fade to a soft blur behind the glass of memory. Let the war settle back into the soil, into the old boxes in your attic, into the spaces between folded letters and faded photographs. You made it, not just through the battles, but through the in-betweens, through the longing, the confusion, the choices you never expected to make, through the kisses you stole and the ones you gave away freely, without knowing how long they'd last. Let that warmth settle now, right behind your ribs, not as regret, not even as pride, just as you, because all those nights, candlelit or rain-drenched, full of laughter or heavy with guilt, they made you. Not in the way medals do, not like parades or history books, but quietly, in the way real life does. So tonight, as your head sinks into the pillow and your breath slows to the rhythm of the past, you don't need to figure it all out. You don't need to decide who was right, or what was moral, or which parts of you still carry a uniform under your skin. You just need to rest. You were a soldier, yes, but you were also a lover, a dreamer, a soul in search of something soft in a world that demanded you be hard. And that, just that, is worth remembering. Close your eyes now. You're home,